Thank you, and welcome to this presentation on LeanUX. In this video, I'll be introducing a basic design methodology that our area uses when working on projects. My goal is to give you an overview of the philosophy that drives our user-centered workflow. I'll also go over some of the individual research and testing activities that you might have heard about, but I will not be getting into too much detail right now. First, we'll go over a couple basic definitions. So the first one is UX, which I'm sure you've heard mentioned before, but you may not be entirely sure what it means. UX is the abbreviation for user experience. And why they decided to go with an X instead of an E, I don't know, but I do agree that UX sounds a lot cooler than UE. Anyway, the term user experience is generally understood to mean the totality of an end user's experience with all aspects of a company. UX as a discipline, and some may call it a mindset, really became widespread with the rise of the dot-com industry in the beginning of the 21st century. So many people associate it with websites or other digital or mobile products. While UX does indeed apply to a user's experience with an online shopping site like Amazon or Zappos, it also applies to a user's interaction with a company's call center, or a user's experience visiting a brick-and-mortar store or office. This is an important point to remember, and I want you to start seeing all around you how UX applies to a lot more than just technology. So the other half of this video's title is Lean, which is another buzzword I'm sure you've heard. Lean is a philosophy that originally came out of car manufacturing in the 90s. It strives to identify and eliminate any process or activity that generates waste. Waste in this context is understood to be anything that a customer, or in our case an end user, would see as not having value to them. So here we have a typical workflow for a technology product, maybe a new web application. You'll see there are 5 phases, and each phase is completed once before the next phase is started. This is called a waterfall workflow. Typically, a project's budget is distributed like this. The analysis phase gets a chunk of money, design gets a smaller chunk, development gets a whole wad of cash because it's seen as the most important, and developers' time costs a lot. And then testing gets just a little bit of money because the project is usually running behind schedule at this point. I think there's some kind of a universal law that states that the farther behind schedule a project is running, the more likely you are to experience a major problem just before launch. Sometimes I wonder if this is the reason why testing is always delayed to the last minute, or in many cases eliminated altogether. Because when you work like this, testing always brings bad news. At this point, it's too late to make major changes to the project, so the project manager tacks on a phase 2 to the project plan, and promises are made to fix the problem in the next release. This is what happens when you only perform one iteration of the design, test, analyze cycle. Now, what if we did more iterations instead? We could spend less on design and development, and we could test a very early prototype. Then we could identify major problems and fix them in the next design and test phases. Each time we did this, we'd find more bugs than we would have if we had only gone through the cycle once. Then at the end, we could be more assured that we would have a finished application that meets the needs of the end users, and we wouldn't have to disappoint people with a buggy first launch and lock ourselves into a mandatory phase 2 that we weren't counting on happening. Believe it or not, even though this looks like more work, more iterations, this is in fact a lean way of working. Design just enough, build just enough, and test your theories. When you do it over and over, you find and you fix errors and problems that make dissatisfied end users, and you ensure the overall success of the whole project. I'm going to show you a model that I developed to help explain the LeanUX way of working. First, I'll give you a quick overview, and then we'll go into it more deeply. This model has 3 major phases, 4 if you count production. The first is the research phase. This is where the analysis happens, where you define the project and its goals, you handle all the paperwork like timelines and project charters, and gather all the data that you have on what is currently happening. There are 2 major cultures that influence this phase of the project, the business side in red and the user side in blue. Both cultures view the project through their own lens, with their own set of biases, and they both have their own desires and needs which are very important to them. Your job during this phase is to figure out who the important players are in each culture. You will need to investigate and document their needs from their point of view. Only after that you can find the sweet spot where the two cultures' needs intersect, and this is where design will occur. One common mistake is to start designing before the research has been accomplished. It's fine to doodle early ideas for your own use, but there is a strong tendency for proponents, and for designers too, to become really attached to a specific approach before research is complete, and without going through sufficient design test analysis cycles. So I recommend that if ideas for possible solutions come to you during the research phase, document it lightly and put it aside to be tested later. Once a thorough understanding of the project has been obtained and a testable solution has been created, it's time to move into the first iteration of the testing and analysis phase. This is where activities like usability testing take place to generate insight that can be used for the next round of design. Like I mentioned before, this cycle gets repeated as many times as there's time and budget for. Twice is really the absolute minimum, but I'd recommend 3 or 4 ideally. After the project has gone through enough iterations to produce a viable product that meets both the needs of the business and the end users, it's time to move into the 4th and final phase for building and deployment. This model contains a lot of embedded information, so now we'll look closer at each phase. So the bigger the project, the more people are interested in it, right? It seems like everyone has an opinion about what the right direction is and how solutions should be implemented and what technology to use and so forth. So the trick at this point is to figure out, by virtue of position in the org chart, or association with an important committee, or just straight up political power, who really knows what is going on in the part of the business that is impacted by the project you are working on right now. These are the stakeholders. These are the people who have a vested interest in the project and its outcome. These people may be charged with overseeing a functional area of the business, or they may just have a personal interest in whatever it is that you're doing. Once you have identified the stakeholders, you'll need to interview them. You need to find out what is important to the business, which is by extension important to them. Where do they see the business heading? What direction do they think the project should go? What are they especially concerned about? You want to do more than just quiz the stakeholders. You need to truly understand the project through the eyes of the business. Besides stakeholder interviews, there are a number of other data gathering activities that are related to business analysis and current state assessment. I'll talk about that at a later time. For now, let's move on to the other culture affecting this product. So just like the business side, on the user side, there are lots of people who are impacted by this product or service. In fact, one of the questions that you should have asked the stakeholders is, who are your users? Many stakeholders will repeat a marketing demographic to you and say something like, the target audience of our product are males and females ages 0 and up. So in other words, everyone. There's an important difference between the idea of audience, which is what a product is targeted at, and users, who are the people from the audience who actually engage with the product. Users are the people who actually visit the website, read the magazine, download the video, or buy the product. The problem is, if you rely on the word of the stakeholders, they will tell you that the user population of a product or service is much larger and a more diverse group than it really is. Or worse, they assume that the users are just like them and think and act the same way that they do. I'll tell you right now that 99.1% of the time that's not true. So the challenge here, just like for business culture, is to identify the users of the product or service that this project will create. Unfortunately, it's harder to do on this side because there are usually way more people. But lucky for you, there are some great user research tools and techniques that you can leverage to help with this, like user personas. Once you've identified the user population, you can really start studying it. A great place to start is to look at data that documents the user's past behavior with a product, like user statistics for a website or records for a call support center. You can also survey the population and ask about past experiences. Be careful, though, if you ask the users to predict their own future behavior, like asking them about what features they'd like or what they do with something they'd never seen before. Users are notoriously inaccurate when invited to engage in wishful or blue sky thinking, especially when it relates to their own behavior. You are much better off relying on empirical data. Fortunately, you can gather that data during the design test analysis phase. The most ideal way to understand users' needs is to interview them after you have studied them enough to identify the core audience groups. You don't have to worry about interviewing large numbers of people. There are tools that can help you segment this population and narrow your focus to a manageable level. User profiles and personas can help generate insight into these groups. And when it comes down to interacting with them via one-on-one interaction, you can do this with as few as 5 people per group. Just like for the business culture, the goal of all these activities is to understand the needs of the user. At this point, we've generated and gathered a lot of materials from all the activities you've done to develop that deep understanding of the two cultures that affect this project. You've got, hopefully, tons of metrics from the business side of things, representing a project that is well scoped, funded, and has committed resources. You should also have tons of artifacts, notes, and data from all your user research activities, as well as deliverables that help translate that understanding to the rest of the project team. So, to wrap up the research phase of this workflow, remember that every project must accommodate the needs of two worlds, two cultures with different values, perspectives, and agendas. In this phase, you need to identify the key players on both sides, interview them to determine their needs, but above all, you must truly understand the project through their eyes. The intersection of these two perspectives is where you want to be. All this material, all this legwork already done, funnels directly into the next phase of the project, which is design. I wish I could explain more about this part to you. There is this famous cartoon by Sidney Harris that shows two scientists standing next to a chalkboard, where an equation like this one had been written. The other scientist says to the first one, "I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. Unfortunately, I can't explain about how all this information combines together into the brain of the project's designer, but it somehow transmutates into a usable product. When people ask me how to do design, it always seems to center around the use of tools, which is really the only thing we can have a discussion about. So I will show you some of my tools. Here's a typical UX designer's desk. I'd like you to please notice all of the super high-tech tools we have in our design process, like pens and pencils, post-it notes, notebooks, and lots of paper. The reality is that we always start out the design process by drawing something, usually lots and lots of things. Just about every single UX designer walks around with a notebook of some kind. We are sketching out solutions, ideas, and cool approaches to other problems we notice around us. At some point, we end up transferring the best ideas to the computer, and they turn into wireframes. Now, how these end up looking depends on the designer's individual style, but you'll notice that they are very monochromatic. We don't use a lot of color or branding here because the emphasis is more on what the product should do and how the elements relate to each other in terms of importance. Once something, anything, has been created, it's time to start the testing phase. This is absolutely critical. Get the design out in front of real humans, preferably humans who will actually try to use this thing. Walk around with your idea and ask them to perform all the important tasks you've already identified during the user research phase. Ask them, how does this work? Does it make sense? Paper wireframes are great for testing. They are easy to change, and because they don't look finished, people are more comfortable suggesting changes or pointing out areas that need more work. In later iterations, more polished and interactive prototypes are more appropriate as they more closely emulate the experience of using the end product. During testing, watch the user's body language closely, especially facial expressions. They tend to be fleeting, so at this point it's helpful to record the tests with video and review them later. When we do record video for a face-to-face usability test, it generates a specially encoded file that contains data about what occurred during the test. When the tests are over, we can feed those recordings into a program called Moray, and we use that to analyze usage behavior for the product we are testing. Moray allows us to generate all sorts of useful statistics about how well the product performed during testing, and it provides objective data which we can then apply to the next iteration of design. This design, test, analyze cycle repeats itself for as many iterations as the project timeline and budget allows. As I've said before, twice is really the absolute minimum, but 3 or 4 times is much better. Every time around, new things are learned, new enhancements get added, and the overall quality goes up. After sufficient iterations, at some point it becomes time to hand off the final plans to the development team for building and deployment. Even though I haven't specifically mentioned the dev team yet, it's important for these individuals to be involved in the project from the beginning. They should be consulted whenever major functionality is added or changed, and included in update meetings along the way as the project progresses. Having the development team at the table allows for early collaboration and encourages a sense of investment in the project. I suggest that you get them involved in the research, take them along when you do the interviews, and ask for their help in building a functional prototype, and then share the results of testing with them. If the developers aren't involved early on in the project, it's just too easy to design in a vacuum and end up with something that the project team doesn't believe in. This can happen even though it's the perfect solution, and believe me, it just sets you up for heartache. Speaking of heartache, UX practitioners do regularly get challenged on the usefulness and validity of their methodologies, so I've collected a few statistics for you. For example, in 2005, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers stated UX can reduce development time from 33 to 50%. Todd Warfel, who is credited with developing one of the most successful design tools for agile and lean workflows, wrote, UX activities like wireframing produce 50% more accurate estimates for build time and cost, 80% reduced requests for clarification by the development team, and 25% reduced rework and bug fixes post-launch. And finally, Forrester Research, an independent technology research company, stated very recently that in their extensive experience with companies of all sizes, every dollar invested in UX generates an average of $100 in return. So, for those of you who like pictures, here's a very easy graph that explains the ROI of early testing and analysis before things are actually built. At the beginning of the project, there's a comparatively large number of possible solutions that might be right for this problem. As these solutions are created and tested, the pool becomes smaller and smaller. When there's relatively few choices, that's the right time to bring in the much more expensive development resources, because once problems are discovered after this point, they become increasingly more difficult to fix. Okay, so that's it. I hope this all made sense to you and it wasn't too painful to sit through this long explanation. This is my first training video, so I am interested in hearing feedback and questions at your upcoming training workshop. We'll take a few minutes to cover anything that you might want more clarification about at that time. If you like this format and you'd like to learn more, also please feel free to bring along ideas for future videos. Thanks for watching.